The desert had a way of remembering. It held onto stories the wind tried to erase, hoofprints buried in dust, bones bleached by the sun, and a silence that wasn't empty but listening. Out there, where the land buckled into ridges and arroyos, where mesquite twisted like arthritic fingers clawing the sky, Rowan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other near the emergency brake, just in case the truck coughed itself into stillness again. She hadn't spoken aloud in hours. Not since leaving the ranger station at dawn, and even then, it had been a clipped conversation, one of those where no one said what they meant. Now, the only sounds were the rattle of the suspension and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk spiraling overhead. The radio didn't work. That was fine. She preferred the static. A map sat folded in the passenger seat, marked in red pen, circles, crosses, arrows. Sightings. Tracks rumors. This patch of government land, technically off-limits, had been quiet for years, until a cluster of locals started reporting wild horse herds appearing and vanishing again like ghosts. That alone wouldn't have drawn her. But when a teenage hiker sent in a blurry photo of what looked like a 10-foot python near one of the ravines, everything shifted. Rowan knew those snakes. Not from books, though she had plenty of those, but from memory. From flesh. The scar on her hip, hidden under canvas pants and old trauma, was a souvenir from the Everglades, back when she still believed fieldwork was just science and not survival. She pulled the truck over where the dirt path disintegrated into a gully, the hood ticking as the engine cooled. Sunlight fell in ruthless sheets, baking the windshield until the rearview mirror wobbled from the heat. She got out, locked the door out of habit, and slung her pack over one shoulder. Binoculars bounced against her chest as she climbed a bluff just east of the ravine, boots crushing brittle sage and scattering ants in frantic directions. Up top, she squinted toward the horizon. And there they were. Mustangs. 20, maybe 25 of them, grazing in tight formation like a woven thing. Tails swishing. Muscles rippling under coats that shone despite the dust. Rowan lowered the binoculars and just watched. She had chased wild horses before. Some herds fled before you got within 100 yards. Some didn't flee at all, just stared, like they'd decided long ago who was predator and who wasn't. This herd watched her. Or rather, the stallion did. A smoky gray with a white blaze down its face, mane tousled and wind-tugged. The lead mare stood off to one side, her ears rotating with radar precision. Foals milled near the center, mostly hidden by the adults, but one, smaller than the rest and clearly new to the world, drifted to the edge like it hadn't learned fear yet. Rowan felt her stomach drop. That foal was too close to the ravine. She raised her binoculars again. Her hands were steady, trained by years of observing predators and prey. She scanned the gully near the foal, tracing the shadows that bled across the sand. Then she saw it. At first it looked like a length of discarded cable, dark and coiled beneath a low overhang. But the longer she looked, the more detail sharpened, subtle movement, a shifting of weight that left a drag mark behind. Not just a python. A Burmese. Older than most. Probably a female, based on the thickness of the midsection. 10 feet easy, maybe more. And it was hunting. Her first instinct was to shout, but that would send the herd running, and leave the foal isolated. The adults were clustered too far up the rise to intervene in time. Rowan's legs were already moving before she finished the thought. She half slid, half jumped down the embankment, the pack slamming against her spine, breath tearing out of her lungs in short, hot bursts. The foal flicked its ears and took a tentative step closer to the python's hiding spot. The snake didn't move. Not yet. Its stillness was its strategy. Rowan grabbed a rock the size of a grapefruit and hurled it with all the force her shoulder could conjure. It thudded into the dirt inches from the coiled form. Dust exploded. The foal skittered sideways, legs flailing. The python surged. Not toward the foal, but toward her. Rowan threw another rock, smaller this time, but it hit. Right on the back of its thick neck. The snake recoiled, hooding its head slightly in a defensive arch. She pulled a flare from her pack, one of the emergency ones, meant for signaling helicopters. She'd never used one for this before. With a rasp, it hissed to life. Fire sputtered at the end, casting red shadows that licked across the sand. She waved it wildly. The snake hesitated. Then it turned, slowly, slipping back beneath its ledge like a curtain drawing shut. The flare fizzled in her grip. Her hand trembled. Blood throbbed in her ears. The foal had frozen about 20 yards away, chest heaving. Its legs looked too long for its body, and its chestnut coat was spattered with dirt. Slowly, cautiously, Rowan took a step back. She didn't want to spook it, not after everything. A crunch behind her made her spin. The herd had moved. Silently, without warning. They stood in a line above the ridge now, watching. The stallion's gaze pierced her. The lead mare took one step forward. Dust curled around her hooves. Rowan felt something then. Not gratitude. Not menace. Witness. She dropped the spent flare. Her knees gave out before she knew she was falling. One hand caught the ground. The other went to her side. Wetness. Sticky. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her shirt just above her hip. Not deep, she guessed, but torn. The python's lunge must have grazed her. She hadn't even felt it in the moment. Pain came next, crawling in behind the adrenaline like a late guest with sharp elbows. She lay back on the sand, the sky spinning. The sun blurred. Her breath stuttered. But she forced herself to look one last time. The foal was walking. Not away, but toward the herd. Its legs wobbled, but its path was steady. When it reached the lead mare, it tucked itself close to her flank, disappearing into the mass of muscle and mane. One of the other mares snorted and flicked her tail against the foal's back. Rowan smiled. Her eyes closed without her meaning them to. The heat pressed down like a blanket. Somewhere, a hawk screamed. And then silence. A different silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind that held breath. She wasn't alone. She didn't know how she knew. But she knew. Something had shifted. And the desert was watching. When the pain set in, it did so quietly. No scream, no shock, just a throb behind Rowan's ribs, as if her body was reminding her that it wasn't built to dance with death anymore. The sun hammered down, unflinching, and the grit clung to her sweat like a second skin. Her hand pressed against her side, fingers sticky with blood, and she thought distantly about how red looked black in that much light. She tried to sit up but managed only to turn slightly onto her side, sucking in a breath that made the edges of her vision pulse white. Somewhere up the ridge, the herd shifted, hooves clicking faintly against stone, tails swishing with measured calm. No alarm, no stampede. They watched her as if she were one of their own, fallen, perhaps, but not forgotten. It was the foal she kept thinking of. The way its legs had locked, the wide whites of its eyes, the innocence so easily swallowed in this place. She had seen animals die before, swiftly, slowly, cruelly, but that one would have haunted her. Not because it was young, but because it didn't know yet what to fear. And somehow, despite every inch of logic in her, that little horse had survived. She closed her eyes and let the pain root deeper, like a tree she couldn't cut down. Her breathing slowed. Her heart felt strange, like it beat in the wrong place, somewhere behind her stomach. The earth beneath her radiated heat, and she could feel it against her cheek, dry and vibrating, as if the desert had its own quiet heartbeat. She must have passed out. When she woke again, the light had changed. Not much, but enough to confuse her. The angle of the sun was lower, more gold than white. Her throat felt like paper scraped over stone. The flare lay extinguished a few feet away, the handle half melted, half buried in dust. Her backpack had slid off her shoulder during the fall, lying just out of reach. Her fingers clawed toward it, inch by inch, every movement setting her side on fire. She made it. Inside, the contents were chaos. Field notes, a backup radio with a dead battery, sunscreen, half a protein bar. But the kit was there, a basic med pouch with gauze, alcohol pads, tape, and a single dose of injectable lidocaine meant for field injuries or animal tranquilization. She didn't think twice. just tore open the seal, jabbed the needle into her thigh, and dropped back to the sand. The relief was sharp and fast. Not perfect, but enough to dull the fire to an ache. She tore a strip of gauze with her teeth, pressed it to the wound, then wrapped herself tight with the bandage roll. The pressure helped. The bleeding had slowed, still there, but not urgent. For now. She crawled to the nearest boulder and propped herself up against it, letting the shade drape over her like a borrowed robe. The wind had picked up slightly. Enough to stir the sand. Enough to remind her she was alive. She drank the last inch of warm water from her bottle. It tasted like plastic and dust, but it kept her from unraveling. That was when she noticed the silence again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was near. Close enough to reach out and touch. She turned her head slowly. They had returned. The Mustangs. Not all of them, just a few. The lead mare stood 5 feet away, nostrils flared, her head high. The foal was beside her, though slightly behind, peeking out like a child hiding behind its mother's skirts. The stallion was not far off, his stance tall and unervingly still. Rowan blinked, afraid she was hallucinating. But the dust clung to their legs. Their shadows stretched long behind them. They were real. The mare stepped closer. Rowan didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her fingers were still wrapped around the neck of her water bottle, but her grip had slackened. The mare stopped less than a foot away. Her eyes were dark, the kind that didn't reflect light but swallowed it. Rowan had never seen anything like it. She could smell the animal, musky, wild, full of sagebrush and sweat. It wasn't fear the mare radiated, nor challenge. It was something quieter. Consideration. Curiosity. Maybe recognition. The foal took one step forward, its small hooves leaving shallow prints in the dust. It sniffed the air, then stretched out its neck, muzzle reaching for Rowan's knee. She felt the touch like a jolt. Not hard. Barely there. But real. Her eyes stung. Not from sand. Not from pain. The mare made a low sound in her throat, a kind of chuff, and turned. Slowly, deliberately, she walked back toward the others. The foal hesitated for a moment longer, then followed. Rowan sat there, shaking, the moment burning itself into the folds of her mind. She didn't believe in miracles. She believed in data. In tracking patterns, in fieldwork and endurance. But this was something she couldn't graph or label or peer review. She checked her wound again. It was manageable. If she rationed her strength, she could probably walk. Probably. Standing was the first test. Her legs trembled, but they held. She kept her hand over the bandage and took one step, then another. Her body protested, but it obeyed. Each footfall left a print. She followed the herd's trail, not because she intended to chase them but because they were headed in the direction of her truck. She hoped. The desert had a way of turning you around, even when you thought you knew its rules. She walked for what felt like hours. The sun dipped lower. The shadows lengthened. Up ahead, she saw movement, dust kicking up in familiar arcs. The herd was still moving, unhurried, silent as a river. They didn't run from her. Didn't scatter. They walked with her. Not beside her. Not behind. But always within view. As if they were making sure she found her way back. When the truck came into view, an old, dented shape crouched against the horizon. Her knees nearly gave out. She leaned against the fender, breath catching in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the door, pulled herself inside. The air inside was suffocating, the seats hot enough to burn, but it was shelter. It was home. She slumped behind the wheel, watching through the cracked windshield as the Mustangs drifted away again. The foal turned once, just a flick of the head, a pause in motion, and then followed its mother into the fading light. Rowan closed her eyes, head against the steering wheel. She didn't cry. Not really. But something in her cracked open just enough to let the silence in. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like peace. Not waves or oceans, but trickles, clear mountain creeks winding through pine-shadowed valleys. She dreamed of cold that stung her fingertips, of snow melt and moss, of childhood hikes with her father before he forgot how to speak her name. She dreamed of her friend, Sarah, laughing in the Everglades rain, hair soaked, arms wide, declaring, "Wild doesn't mean dangerous. It means alive." Then she opened her eyes. Dry heat. Blinding sun. Her body aching in places she hadn't named in years. The dream fled, taking the softness with it. Reality returned like a slap, bandaged side, parched throat, the weight of dust in her lashes. She sat inside her truck, engine off, windows cracked. Everything smelled of sweat and heat and coppery blood. Outside, the desert had settled into a golden hush, that strange middle hour where nothing moved, as if time itself was too hot to continue. She reached across the passenger seat, fingers fumbling through the tangle of supplies she'd tossed there weeks ago and never organized. Beneath a sun-bleached map and 2 shattered pencils, her hand closed around a plastic bottle, half full, maybe. She twisted the cap with numb hands and drank. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it flowed down her throat like a promise. When she finally stepped out, legs stiff and lungs uncertain, the air pressed against her skin like invisible cloth. She leaned on the truck for balance, eyes scanning the ridge beyond the ravine. They were still there. The Mustang herd, stretched like a painting across the backdrop of wind-worn stone and blue sky. But they were closer now. Much closer. And they weren't grazing. They were watching. Rowan's heart ticked up, slow but deliberate. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But something about the way they stood, not rigid, not casual, but still, struck a chord in her bones. Animals didn't usually linger near humans unless they had learned to expect food, and this land didn't breed that kind of convenience. She moved slowly, one foot after the other, favoring her uninjured side. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust. She kept her hands visible, empty, respectful. Something about this moment demanded reverence. The first to move was the lead mare. Her coat was the color of old pennies, burnished and deep. She stepped forward, ears forward, not pinned back, not alarmed. Just aware. Present. Rowan paused, unsure whether to continue. But then the foal emerged from behind the stallion's flank, still clumsy but taller now, with a boldness it hadn't carried days before. It trotted forward, stopped just out of reach, and stared. Rowan knelt, not just to lessen her size, but because her body demanded it. Pain flared in her ribs and thigh, dull and hot, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was still part of this world. Still breathing. She didn't speak. Words felt like they would shatter the moment. The foal took another step, nostrils flaring. Rowan extended a hand, palm up, not reaching, only offering. The foal hesitated, ears twitching, then dipped its nose, whiskers brushing her fingers. A heartbeat passed. Then 2. And then the rest of the herd moved as one. They surrounded her. Not close, just enough to form a loose circle. The kind a pack might make around a wounded member. Not trapping. Not threatening. Encircling. Holding space. She froze, heart beating so hard it blurred her hearing. The air thickened. She could hear the creak of saddle leather that wasn't there, the ghosts of stampedes centuries old. The history of this land pulsed under her knees. They knew. She didn't know how, but they knew. Maybe not in the way humans measured knowledge. But instinct ran deep. Horses read silence better than any creature alive. They knew when one of their own had fallen. They knew who returned mercy. She had saved the foal. And now the herd had come back for her. Rowan felt tears start in her chest before they reached her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. Not when Sarah died. Not when her grant funding evaporated. Not when the world quietly forgot the wild spaces she spent her life trying to defend. But now, with hooves stamping softly in the dirt and 20 pairs of eyes reflecting the sky back at her, she broke. Not loud. Just a slow surrender. She folded forward, forehead to dust, hands splayed. Not a collapse, an offering. She stayed there, breath shaking, pain sharp and real, until something warm touched her shoulder. The lead mare. A single nudge. Gentle. Questioning. Rowan sat up slowly. The mare didn't move away. Behind her, the stallion watched, unmoving as stone. The circle didn't break for a long time. When it did, it wasn't abrupt. One by one, the horses turned, silent as shadows, and began walking west. Not fast. Not far. Just enough to let her stand. Rowan rose, legs trembling, and followed. They didn't run. They didn't flee. They allowed her behind them. Not within the herd, not quite. But not apart, either. The sun hung low now, amber and syrup thick, bleeding into the creases of the earth. The wind stirred, lifting strands of her hair, cooling the sweat from her skin. They walked like that for a mile, maybe more. She stopped when they did. At a shallow rise above the canyon floor, they gathered. Rowan leaned against a rock, hands on her knees, chest heaving. The foal circled back and stood 10 feet away, curious still. Not frightened. She watched them graze, rest, interact. So much communication passed in silence. Nudges, glances, weight shifts. And she thought how strange it was that humans needed so many words, yet often meant so little. The lead stallion finally approached, mane lifted by the wind. He paused at her side, not facing her, but standing parallel. Like they were looking at the same horizon. She didn't reach out. She didn't need to. They stood that way until the stars came out, one by one. No streetlights here. No buzzing electricity. Just the hush of the desert, the creak of distant trees, the soft snorts and sighs of animals at rest. Rowan lay down near her truck that night, wrapped in an emergency blanket from the cab. The herd slept within sight. She didn't try to photograph them. Didn't take notes. Some things weren't meant to be studied. Just remembered. In the lull before dawn, she dreamt again, not of water this time, but of hoofs pounding earth, of thunder without rain, of bodies in motion that needed no permission to exist. She awoke with the taste of dust and something older in her mouth, something sacred and fierce. The sun breached the ridge. The Mustangs were already gone, but hoofprints remained. She pressed her palm into one of them, held it there, felt the pulse of the desert echo back. A circle had closed, but another was just beginning. The ranger at the outpost leaned back in his chair, boots kicked up on a crate of unlabeled water canisters, and watched Rowan fill out the incident report with a kind of wary fascination. She wrote with her left hand, the right still healing, her ribs bound tight beneath her faded shirt, and her writing was neat, deliberate. No embellishments. No emotion. When she signed the last page and handed it over, he skimmed it, eyebrows lifting only once. "Python?" he asked, not in disbelief, but in the tone of someone testing the edges of what they could accept. 10-foot female. Burmese. Non-native. Nesting signs at the ravine mouth, she said, voice hoarse from the drive, from the memory, from something unnamed. Likely descended from the same group we flagged in the 90s. You'll need traps. Professional removal. And the horse. She shook her head once, brief. Safe. For now. That was all she gave them. Not because she couldn't say more, but because what mattered most didn't belong in an incident report. The circle in the desert. The foal's breath on her palm. The way the Mustangs had stood around her like ancient gods with dirt under their hooves. There was no checkbox for any of it. No code for miracle. She left the station before the paperwork cooled. The motel she checked into on the edge of town was the kind with sun-faded shutters and a dusty vending machine outside the front office. The clerk gave her a sideways look, but said nothing about the limp or the stitched wound along her ribs. That night, Rowan sat cross-legged on the motel bed, a map spread before her, the window cracked open just enough to let the desert wind whisper against the curtains. Her fingers hovered over the coordinates she'd circled months ago, the ones that had led her to the herd. She picked up a marker and drew a small ring around that spot, not red for danger, not black for loss. but green. Then she put the cap back on, folded the map, and stared into the dark. She didn't sleep. Not deeply. A week passed. Then 2. She took field calls. Responded to local wildlife alerts. Worked the small cases that came in. Tangled deer, suspicious tracks near a cattle yard, feral dogs sighted near a trailer park. But none of it touched her. Not really. She was moving. Working. Breathing. But her soul was still out there. Then, one morning, the call came. A rancher named Delaney, terse on the phone. "You the one who logged the python out by Ridge 9? "Yes. I got something you need to see. It ain't dead. But it ain't scared of fences neither." She drove 2 hours through half-abandoned roads and a rising wall of heat to reach the property line. Delaney met her at the gate, silver-haired, wide-shouldered, and suspicious by default. He pointed toward the east field. She walked out, following the trail he'd mentioned. There it was. Not the python. Not this time. A hoofprint. Not fresh, but recent. Then another. Then more. She followed them, heart thudding, not with fear, but with recognition. The pattern. The size. The lightness of step. Mustangs. Wild. Unbranded. Moving together. And there, at the crest of a low hill, against the pink breath of morning, she saw them. The herd. Just as before. The lead stallion still carried his quiet strength, his ears trained forward. The mare, her coat dark against the pale light, stood with a new tension in her spine. And the foal, no longer a stumbling shadow, but strong-legged, dust-slick, bold, watched her. Rowan didn't wave. Didn't call out. She just stood. And for a long breath, they did too. Then the foal trotted forward, paused, and did something she didn't expect. It reared slightly. Not high. Not aggressive. Just enough to show muscle. Confidence. Then it turned, flicked its tail, and vanished with the others over the ridge. That was when she knew. This wasn't over. Back in town, she stopped at the supply store. Bought what she needed without explaining why. New binoculars, heat maps, emergency flares, a satellite phone, a better med kit. She gathered every piece of gear she'd used in the past 10 years and packed it with more care than usual. No rush. No schedule. Just readiness. She returned to the desert 2 days later. The truck carried her to the edge of that same ravine, the place where she'd bled into the earth and seen the world shift around her. She camped that night under the stars, no tent, just a roll and the scent of juniper burning low in the fire. Coyotes called in the distance. An owl passed overhead like a secret. And sometime before dawn, she woke with her breath caught in her throat. Not fear. Not pain. Just the sense that she wasn't alone. She sat up slowly, heart steady, eyes wide. Silhouettes stood on the ridge. Not close. Not threatening. Just there. Watching. She raised a hand. Not to wave. Not to summon. Just to acknowledge. The wind stirred the ashes of her fire. And when she looked again, they were gone. But hoofprints remained. Later she would walk those prints, following where they led, not to capture, not to contain, but to bear witness. Some people tracked for control. Rowan tracked to remember. She logged the movements. Not in digital maps or reports, but in sketches, pressed into notebooks with graphite and ink. She drew the terrain, the spacing between prints, the peculiar markings left when the foal paused too long in one spot. She began to know their rhythms, their loops, the way they circled back after storms. She watched them drink from a hidden spring only the locals whispered about. And once, just once, she watched them sleep. All of them. Folded limbs, heads bowed, the foal curled between the stallion and the mare, like a secret tucked into the earth's spine. Rowan sat on a far rock, unmoving, unseen, and she wept. Not for herself. Not for Sarah. But because the wild had trusted her with something too big to name. Months passed. Seasons turned. She wrote an article, anonymous. A piece for a conservation journal titled Circles in the Dust. It told of an old herd rediscovered, of non-native threats, of how some stories aren't meant to be owned, only kept alive through careful observation. The piece spread. Quietly, people began to whisper again about the Mustangs. Not to chase them, but to believe in them. And one afternoon, standing at the edge of a bluff with the wind tangling her hair, Rowan understood something. Some stories don't end. They echo. They find new mouths to speak them, new soil to bury and grow again. She took off her hat, let the wind carry her breath into the open, and whispered only one word. Thank you. Behind her, the desert held its silence. But she knew it was listening. It always had been.